When you ask why people dislike atheists, you quickly realize the hostility is rarely about actual individuals. It's about what atheism represents in the minds of believers. For many, the very word conjures fear, suspicion, or anger before they even meet someone who identifies that way. This isn't because atheists are inherently threatening. It's because rejecting belief challenges the story that holds communities together. If you grow up being told that morality, love, and meaning come only from God, then someone who denies God looks like they're rejecting all of those things at once. Even if they live kindly, even if they care deeply, the mere label atheist feels like an attack on the foundation of life itself. That perception fuels stereotypes. Atheists are often painted as arrogant, cold, immoral, or lost. None of those traits are inherent to disbelief. They are projections of what believers fear would happen if their own faith collapsed. In other words, people don't hate atheists because of what atheists are. They hate atheists because of what atheists make them confront. Psychologists have studied this distrust, and the results are striking. In surveys across many countries, atheists consistently rank among the least trusted groups, often below minorities, immigrants, or even people with criminal records. When asked who they'd trust as a neighbor, teacher, or political leader, many respondents instinctively avoid atheists. Why? One explanation is what's called moral contamination. Religion has long tied morality to divine authority. If someone doesn't believe in God, they're assumed to lack an internal compass, even though evidence shows atheists are just as moral, sometimes more so, than religious believers. This fear is less about evidence and more about deep cultural conditioning. For centuries, institutions taught that without God, society collapses into chaos. That message seeps so deeply into culture that even non-religious people sometimes carry subconscious suspicion toward atheists. Hatred doesn't need evidence to survive. It only needs repetition. History also explains part of the hostility. In many eras, being labeled an atheist wasn't just controversial, it was dangerous. In medieval Europe, disbelief was equated with treason, punishable by exile or death. In colonial America, being accused of atheism could ruin reputations and cut off livelihoods. Those old patterns left a mark. Even though societies claim to value freedom of belief, the idea of rejecting religion altogether still triggers suspicion. Atheism has been portrayed as the enemy of order, the destroyer of tradition, the force behind communism or tyranny. Politicians still weaponize the label, painting opponents as godless to discredit them. This long history of demonization shapes modern attitudes. Hatred lingers not because atheists are harmful, but because cultures have spent centuries equating disbelief with danger. When people inherit those assumptions without questioning them, atheists remain scapegoats even in societies that claim to be free. At a personal level, atheists provoke discomfort because they embody doubt. For a believer, it's one thing to wrestle privately with questions. It's another to encounter someone who has already stepped beyond faith and seems to live fine without it. That presence makes internal doubts harder to ignore. This is why atheists are often accused of being angry or rebellious, even when they're calm. The very act of not believing is seen as confrontation. Atheists don't need to mock or preach. Simply existing outside the framework of faith challenges its authority. People hate atheists not because atheists are constantly attacking them, but because atheists represent the possibility that belief is optional. And once belief is optional, its power to control weakens. For communities built on that control, disbelief is intolerable. Despite the hostility, there's a paradox. When people are asked if they know an atheist personally, their answers often soften. Abstract atheists are distrusted, but real atheists, friends, co-workers, family members, are accepted. Hatred thrives in the abstract but struggles in the personal. This shows that much of the hatred is ignorance, not genuine encounter. When someone discovers their kind neighbor, their reliable doctor, or their loyal friend is an atheist, the stereotype breaks. The fear doesn't disappear overnight, but it cracks enough to let reality in. And that's where change begins, because the more atheists are visible, the harder it becomes to sustain the myths. Hatred built on imagination can't survive too much contact with reality. When people say they dislike atheists, often what they mean is they dislike what atheism represents in contrast to their worldview. For many believers, their faith isn't just personal. It's tied to identity, morality, family, and community. So when someone rejects that framework, it feels like more than disagreement. It feels like rejection of the people themselves. This is why religious parents sometimes respond so strongly when a child comes out as atheist. It's not just that they worry about the child's soul, it's that they interpret disbelief as betrayal. The foundation they built their lives on is being called into question, not by strangers, but by someone they love. That emotional weight creates defensiveness. Hatred often masks fear, fear of being wrong, fear of losing community, fear of what happens if belief is not as secure as they thought. In that way, atheists become mirrors people don't want to look into, not because of hostility they express, but because of the doubt they symbolize. Another reason people claim to hate atheists is because atheism undermines a powerful tool of social control. For centuries, religious institutions have tied morality and obedience to fear of divine judgment, heaven and hell, reward, and punishment. These stories have been used to guide behavior. When atheists say they don't believe, they also say they don't fear hell, don't seek heaven, don't obey divine rules. That independence is threatening to institutions built on obedience. Leaders who rely on religion to maintain authority find disbelief especially dangerous because it reveals that morality and cooperation can exist without fear of punishment. And when people realize they can live ethically without divine oversight, the entire system of control weakens. It's easier to attack atheists than to confront that uncomfortable truth, which is why hatred of atheists is often louder in communities where obedience to authority is central. There's also the tribal instinct. Humans evolved in groups, and belonging was often tied to shared beliefs. Religion provided that sense of unity, an us versus them identity marker. In that framework, atheists don't just represent difference, they represent outsiders who reject the tribe's most sacred bond. This makes atheists particularly unsettling because they're not outsiders from another tribe, like members of a different religion. They are insiders who refuse the tribe's defining belief. That rejection feels more threatening than competition. A rival religion still affirms the idea of faith, even if it's in a different form. Atheism affirms no faith at all, and that undermines the whole system. So hatred of atheists often comes from the instinct to protect the group. It's less about evidence and more about preserving cohesion. And history shows how harshly societies treat those who step outside sacred boundaries. Media and cultural narratives also play a huge role. In many films, books, and speeches, atheists are cast as cold scientists, ruthless villains, or joyless skeptics. Rarely do mainstream portrayals show them as compassionate neighbors or thoughtful friends. This lopsided depiction reinforces stereotypes in the public imagination. Politicians exploit this too. Calling someone godless has long been an easy way to discredit them, to imply untrustworthiness without needing evidence. Even today, in some countries, candidates openly stress their faith as a way to signal morality, while atheists often avoid the label altogether for fear of backlash. These cultural scripts make atheists easy targets. If you're constantly told atheists are arrogant, immoral, or dangerous, you'll begin to believe it. And because most people don't knowingly meet atheists, or don't realize they have, the stereotypes persist unchallenged. But despite all of this, the landscape is shifting. Surveys show that distrust of atheists, while still strong, is weaker among younger generations. Exposure, education, and diversity reduce fear. When people realize they already know atheists as co-workers, classmates, relatives, the stereotypes lose power. This doesn't erase hatred overnight, but it weakens the foundations. Hatred requires ignorance to thrive. The more visible and humanized atheists become, the harder it is to maintain blanket hostility. And perhaps this is why hostility feels sharpest in communities where atheists are least visible. The less exposure people have, the easier it is to demonize. But as societies grow more interconnected, those walls of ignorance are crumbling, slowly but surely. One of the strongest reasons people claim to hate atheists is the assumption that without God, life must be meaningless. This belief is deeply ingrained in many religious traditions, where purpose is tied to divine design. If you remove that framework, the conclusion many jump to is that atheists live in despair, with no reason to love, create, or care. That assumption is not just wrong, it's insulting. Atheists create meaning through relationships, creativity, learning, and contribution. They find purpose in family, art, science, and community. The idea that only divine command gives life value is narrow, and it ignores the countless ways humans construct meaning outside of faith. But this belief fuels hostility. To someone raised to think morality and purpose come only from God, atheists look like they've chosen emptiness, and people fear emptiness. They fear the void, so they project that fear outward, turning it into hatred for those who live without the story they rely on. Another layer is the fear of death. Religion promises comfort in the face of mortality, heaven, reunion with loved ones, eternal peace. Atheism, by contrast, accepts death as final. No afterlife, no eternal continuation. For many believers, this acceptance looks terrifying, and terrifying things are often despised. Atheists don't necessarily celebrate death, but they face it differently. They value life precisely because it's finite. That perspective can seem incomprehensible to someone who clings to eternal life as their deepest hope. And when something is incomprehensible, it's often labeled dangerous or wrong. This is why atheists are sometimes seen as threats at funerals or in grief. Their quiet acceptance of mortality contrasts sharply with faith's promises. That contrast can make believers uncomfortable, even angry, because it highlights the fragility of their own belief in the face of loss. Social conformity adds another reason for hostility. In many communities, religion isn't just a private choice, it's a social expectation. Attending services, participating in rituals, affirming shared beliefs. These are signals of belonging. Atheists disrupt that system. By refusing to participate, they reveal that the rituals aren't universal. They remind everyone that conformity is optional, and that reminder threatens the cohesion of the group. It's easier for communities to paint atheists as dangerous outsiders than to admit their rituals are simply traditions, not eternal truths. This pressure is especially strong in small towns or tight-knit families where church is central. An atheist in those spaces isn't just different, they're seen as disloyal. Hatred grows not because atheists are doing harm, but because they refuse to play a role that keeps everyone else comfortable. We should also recognize the role of fear-based preaching. Many religious leaders actively encourage suspicion of atheists. Sermons describe them as lost, prideful, even agents of evil. These messages aren't just theological, they're psychological. They shape communities to see atheists not as neighbors, but as threats to salvation. This is reinforced by selective storytelling. When an atheist commits a crime, their lack of belief is emphasized. When a believer commits the same crime, it's treated as an exception. Over time, this one-sided narrative builds a false impression that atheists are inherently less moral. The irony is that statistical studies often show the opposite. Rates of violent crime, divorce, and corruption are not lower in highly religious societies. In fact, in some cases they're higher. But facts rarely erase fear when fear is constantly reinforced by authority figures. Despite all these sources of hostility, atheists continue to challenge the stereotypes simply by living openly. The more visible they are as teachers, scientists, artists, parents, and friends, the more the myths unravel. People slowly realize that atheists are not immoral, joyless, or dangerous. They are ordinary people making choices about belief the same way others make choices about faith. Hatred thrives in silence, but it weakens with visibility. As more atheists speak out, not necessarily to debate, but simply to exist openly, the harder it becomes to sustain prejudice. It's one thing to hate an abstract label, it's another to hate your kind neighbor, your loyal friend, or your honest co-worker once you know they don't believe. The real danger to hostility isn't argument, it's reality. And reality shows that atheists, like everyone else, are simply human. Another reason for hostility toward atheists comes from the fear of losing tradition. Religion, especially in the West, has long been tied to cultural identity. Holidays, weddings, funerals, national symbols, they've all been infused with Christian meaning. To step away from faith isn't just to reject belief, it's to step outside of cultural continuity. For believers, atheists can look like a threat to heritage itself. If we stop going to church, who will carry on the rituals? If we stop believing, what happens to the holidays that hold our families together? These questions turn atheists into symbols of cultural decline. The hatred is less about disbelief and more about fear that cherished traditions will vanish. But traditions can survive without theology. People still celebrate Christmas without believing in the nativity story. Families still gather for Easter without needing to affirm resurrection. What changes is not the gathering itself, but the claim that it's the only way to live meaningfully. And that shift can be unsettling to those who rely on tradition for stability. Economic and political interests also fuel hostility. Religious institutions have long relied on influence, donations, and loyalty. Atheists represent not just a loss of members, but a loss of power. When people stop believing, they stop tithing, they stop volunteering, they stop voting in line with religious agendas. This creates an incentive for leaders to stoke fear of atheism. By framing disbelief as dangerous, they rally communities to stay inside the fold. Fear keeps people loyal, and loyalty keeps the institution alive. Hatred of atheists, then, is often less about theology and more about preserving authority. This becomes especially clear during debates over laws and policy. From marriage rights to reproductive rights, atheists are painted as threats to Christian values, not because they seek to harm society, but because their existence undermines the assumption that those values must dominate everyone. Hostility here is political strategy disguised as moral concern. There's also the psychological comfort of having an enemy. Throughout history, groups have bonded by defining themselves against outsiders. Having a common enemy strengthens internal unity. For centuries, atheists have been a convenient target, easy to caricature, hard to defend, and symbolically powerful. When preachers warn about the godless, congregations feel reassured of their own righteousness. Hatred of atheists functions as a way to reinforce belonging. We are not like them, therefore we are good. This us versus them framing is less about reality and more about identity maintenance. But the problem with building cohesion through an enemy is that it requires constant hostility. The moment atheists are seen as ordinary neighbors, the contrast collapses, which is why rhetoric against atheists is often so exaggerated. The hostility has to be dramatic to keep the lines sharp. In some cases, hatred comes from genuine misunderstanding. Many people have never had a conversation with someone who openly identifies as atheist. They rely on stereotypes shaped by second-hand accounts, sermons, or media. Without real interaction, the gap between perception and reality grows. This misunderstanding can take strange forms. Some believe atheists secretly worship evil forces. Others assume atheists have no sense of morality, or that they must be constantly angry at religion. These misconceptions might sound absurd, but they're common in communities with little exposure to open disbelief. Bridging this gap requires visibility and dialogue. When people actually know atheists personally, the hostility often softens. It doesn't always lead to agreement, but it does chip away at the myths. Hatred needs distance to survive, and the more people meet atheists, the less room there is for caricature. Despite all these pressures, hostility toward atheists is slowly weakening in many Western societies. Younger generations are more likely to say they would vote for an atheist politician or trust an atheist teacher than their parents or grandparents. The more diverse societies become, the less any single worldview can claim monopoly. This doesn't mean hatred has vanished. In some regions, suspicion remains strong, and in others, atheists still face stigma, discrimination, or exclusion. But the long-term trajectory shows growing acceptance. The myths are harder to sustain when evidence contradicts them. The stereotypes are harder to maintain when reality interrupts them. Hatred may persist in pockets, but it's losing the cultural dominance it once had. And that shift suggests something important. The problem was never atheists themselves. It was the fear, conditioning, and authority structures that painted them as enemies. And as those structures weaken, so too does the hostility. One of the most telling signs of why people hate atheists is how the label itself is treated. In many places, atheist isn't just a description, it's an accusation. It carries weight that other belief labels don't. Someone can say they're Catholic, Protestant, or Muslim, and it signals membership. But to say you're atheist signals rejection. That rejection is what fuels so much hostility, because atheists are seen not as people with a different perspective, but as people who've actively turned away. In the eyes of believers, that choice looks like defiance, and defiance is always more threatening than difference. But the irony is that most atheists aren't defined by rejection. They're defined by curiosity, by honesty, by the willingness to admit they don't believe. Yet the label is treated as an insult because it highlights the fragility of the systems it critiques. The louder the hostility, the clearer the insecurity it reflects. Hatred also survives because atheists represent uncertainty in a world that craves certainty. Religion often promises firm answers to life's hardest questions: why we're here, what happens after death, how to live. Atheism doesn't provide a single replacement. Instead, it acknowledges uncertainty and encourages individuals to build meaning themselves. That openness is liberating for some, but terrifying for others. For those who've built their lives on unquestionable answers, the idea that uncertainty can be lived with is unbearable. So instead of exploring it, they attack the people who embody it. Hatred becomes a shield against doubt. But uncertainty isn't emptiness. It's space for growth, for freedom, for creating meaning that is chosen rather than imposed. And while hostility clings to the illusion of certainty, more and more people are learning that living without fixed answers can be more honest and even more fulfilling. It's also important to note how much of this hostility is generational. Older generations grew up in cultures where religion was assumed, where disbelief was rare or hidden. In that context, atheists were seen as outsiders rebelling against everything normal. Younger generations, though, are growing up surrounded by diversity. They have atheist classmates, agnostic friends, secular teachers. For them, disbelief is not shocking, it's ordinary. And when something is ordinary, it's harder to hate. This doesn't mean prejudice disappears overnight. It lingers, especially in regions where religion still dominates politics and community life, but the trajectory is clear. The more visible atheists become, the less hatred holds power. And over time, what was once scandalous becomes unremarkable. Another overlooked reason people hate atheists is because atheism removes the easiest explanations for suffering. Religion often frames pain as part of a divine plan, or as punishment, or as preparation for eternal reward. When atheists reject that, they force people to confront suffering directly. Without those comforting narratives, that confrontation is unsettling. It's easier to hate atheists than to face the possibility that suffering has no grand design. It's easier to call them cold than to admit that the universe might be indifferent. Hostility in this case is a defense mechanism. But in rejecting those explanations, Atheists don't deny meaning. They shift it. They focus on human responses to suffering, on empathy, on action. Instead of waiting for divine intervention, they look for ways to relieve pain here and now. And that approach, while dismissed as threatening, often leads to more practical compassion. In the end, the hatred of atheists says more about the societies that produce it than about the people themselves. It reveals fears of uncertainty, fears of loss, fears of freedom. It reveals the fragility of traditions that depend on unquestioned belief. And it reveals how deeply authority relies on having outsiders to blame. But those fears don't have to define the future. As more people live openly without belief, as more stories are shared, as more stereotypes break apart, hostility loses its foundation. Hatred needs ignorance to survive, and ignorance is harder to maintain in a connected world. The truth is that atheists don't destroy morality, meaning, or community. They simply show that those things exist without divine command. And for some, that truth is liberating. For others, it's terrifying. But whether embraced or resisted, it's a reality that grows harder to deny. So why do people hate atheists? Not because atheists are dangerous, but because atheists remind the world that belief is a choice. And when belief is a choice, control fades. That's why hostility has been so strong, and why it may never fully disappear. But it's also why, over time, hatred will matter less, because the more people see atheists not as abstract threats, but as ordinary humans, the less room there is for fear.